Good morning, everyone. Welcome to this webinar of Is COVID-19 a Geopolitical Game Changer? As everyone can see, this morning is pretty busy. Beijing just passed its national security law for Hong Kong. India just blocked more than 50 Chinese apps. And China and the United States are exchanging their hostilities towards each other. So it's really an extraordinary time. And so this morning we are very honored and pleased to invite three experienced economists and experienced China watchers. Together, I think you three present over 100 years of experience watching this country and the world. Okay, starting from Dr. Tao. He's the Vice Chairman of Great China and Private Banking for Asia Pacific Credit Suisse. As far as I know, Dr. Tao, you have like 30 years experience in writing about Chinese economy during the world, right?
I've been watching China for 27 years.
Yes, almost 30. So.
Yes.
Next is Louis Kais, the head of Asia Economics for Oxford Economics. And as we have introduced before, Mr. Kais has helped the Chinese government making this when he worked at World Bank of the development plans. That's the 11th five-year plan.
That's right.
Yes.
That's a while ago.
And then Mr. David Dodwell, Executive Director for Hong Kong APEC Trade Policy Study Group and CEO of Strategic Access Limited. You also having spent 18 years with FT covering China and Hong Kong before you start your own venture in this policy advisory group, right?
From 1980, yeah.
Yes, from 1980. So, and I'm Zhou Xing, the political economy editor with South China Morning Post. And also, before we beginning, we would like to give a big thank you to our sponsor for this webinar, Credit Suisse. So let me start with one big question, because all these news events happening, people attribute it to the rivalry between China and the United States, one sitting power and one rising challenger. So the big question is, of course, can China and the United States actually reconcile their fundamental differences in terms of values and geopolitical things? Hong Kong is just part of the puzzle. For China, Taiwan must be reunited with the motherland. Hong Kong must be abandoned. Whatever China do in Xinjiang or its domestic civil society is China's domestic affair. South China Sea must be protected as Chinese sovereignty. But for the United States, all these claims kind of like, it's a rising power trying to change our values, try to change our geopolitics, and it's not to be tolerated. U.S. has helped China's rise. Now it's time for U.S. to rethink its policy again, maybe to start to contain China. So how this is going to evolve? Where's the middle ground? How can the two big powers find like reconciliation and move this world forward? Dr. Tao, starting from you.
Okay. A while ago, I saw a cartoon picture. The picture shows that it's a chessboard.
Yeah.
The upper part of the chessboard is Chinese chess. And lower part is the chess or the Western chess.
Yeah.
The two chess games have similar kind of goal.
Yeah.
But other than that, everything's different. They have different pieces. They have different rules. And you probably need to use different strategies. I think this is pretty telling about the wrestlings between China and the United States at this moment. You ask how this thing's going to evolve. First, I want to say that within my lifetime, I would not be able to see a real peaceful time between world number one and number two. Because in the end of the day, in my opinion, this is about the battle, the wrestling between world number one and number two. It's for the global influence, whether it's trade war, this tech war, or even Hong Kong. That's just part of this eventually for this global influence. I think it's going to take a long time. But in the meantime, there will be some ups and downs. And personally, I think that we probably will see continued problems for now. But occasionally, we might have some interesting time, settle down time. Okay. What I see 20 years down the road, one globe, two tech systems, two domestic markets. two sides will exchange, will have interface. They do trade, but I see a firewall in between.
Well, that's a bold statement. For your lifetime, you won't see the end of the rivalry between China and the United States, and the whole world basically divided into two spheres. So, Louis, do you agree with that, or do you see new things here?
I think it is pretty likely, especially that we see these two spheres in the tech sphere and standards, things like that. I think we will watch to what extent can you still engage and trade with each other if you do have those two different spheres. And so I worry a little bit about that. I also wonder about all the bystanders, all the other countries. And I think, one interesting aspect about the Cold War, of course, is that when we think about Cold War, we think about the Cold War between the Soviet Union and the United States, right?
Yes.
One issue is that was a very different setting globally, because these two blocs had very little interaction with each other in terms of economic engagement, things like that. The other, a little bit intimidating aspect about this Cold War is that it ended with one side losing, right?
Yeah.
And so Dr. Tao's vision of these two, powers eventually somehow cohabitating with each other would be, a much more preferable outcome of this current Cold War. I just don't know to what extent it is possible.
Okay, so Mr. Dodwell, this morning we have already heard this news. U.S. is going to cancel Hong Kong's special status, basically downgrade Hong Kong's status on the export control list. Will this be, pretty big for China and for Hong Kong? Because I hear different views on that.
I think there are much larger forces at work than this particular initiative. My sense is still that the initiatives focused specifically on Hong Kong and linked with the security bill are more to do with pre-presidential election theatre than substance. That may not be true after November, depending on the outcome, because we may then at some point get substance. But in the meanwhile, I think this is much more to do with theatre and influencing opinion within the United States, with a generic effort to depict China as a problem wherever you can define it as a problem.
As far as I know, as far as you know, how important Hong Kong is for China's tech sector.
I think that in its own right, Hong Kong is not a heavy hitter in technology at all. It's an important conduit for funding into the tech sector. It's important for listings for companies in the tech sector that want to list in due course. Hong Kong may be actually a beneficiary of current trends out of that. If companies that would have otherwise listed in the States or the UK will end up listing in Hong Kong, we'll have to see.
But some people saying, because of Hong Kong, Shenzhen become China's Silicon Valley. But because of, although, the Hong Kong government said all the 400 or 100 million US dollars worth of imports from the United States are actually on the export control list, but they are all key components, vital for the whole maybe high-tech industry in the Greater Bay Area. Do you agree with that?
I think that the actual work within Hong Kong that's being done to drive the tech sector in China is very, very small. And there is no question that what's going on at the moment between the US and China has very serious ramifications for China's tech sector in particular terms and the global tech sector in general terms. If we are going to talk about polarization, decoupling in the short term, I think this is one of the areas where we're going to see it most powerfully articulated. Hong Kong, I don't believe, is going to be a big player in that discussion going forward.
Okay. Dr. Hudson,
well, if you see the first few targets that the White House decided to attack in the tech domain, it started with Zhongxin, and then with Huawei,
Yes.
and then with Dajiang. These three companies actually all originated from one small street district of Nanshan of Shenzhen.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so it became the White House versus
Yeah.
Nanshan district
Yes.
instead of the entire China.
Yeah.
What I want to raise this is because I believe that the ability to innovate, Shenzhen probably has more ability than any other cities in China.
Mm-hmm.
On the other hand, the difference between Shenzhen today and say Silicon Valley 60 years ago, actually Silicon Valley 60 years ago, it was just a field of cherry trees, no tech at all. Okay, in 80 years ago, in 1960. What happened was when they connected the ideas, talent, money, information flows, and capital flows, then Silicon Valley boomed, and this is the center of the global tech sector. Where I do see that Shenzhen has that potential. Shenzhen has a lot of talents, lots of ideas, and the companies are very aggressive and innovative. Where Shenzhen lacks is the loop in the capital area.
Okay.
And that's where Hong Kong conveniently fit into that. All right. And what you see as the Chinese companies moving away from the US listing to Hong Kong listing, this role is going to be enhanced significantly. Okay. If Shenzhen and Hong Kong could get connected, then this is a significantly more important part of China for the technology world, maybe even to the world perspective. Okay, but whether this can be done or not, the time could tell. I just want to say that while Hong Kong probably is not that important for the tech, but Hong Kong is an extremely important place for the Chinese companies doing their fundraising activities.
That's a very interesting point. So naturally, we're going on to the next stage. What will the U.S. do in terms of the financial front? We're already seeing that in the act passed just by the Senate, the U.S. said it will sanction individuals and institutions with close businesses with these individuals. So, Mr. Kais, will that be possible? The United States have some big financial sanctions against Hong Kong, and then to undermine Hong Kong's role as a capital gateway to China and a financial center?
I think there is the possibility for the US to do that. Of course, whether the US will push for that depends on many equations, many dynamics. It depends foremost on the overall relationship between the US and China and how tensions flare up. We know that the US has the power to hurt countries in that financial arena, especially by the nature of the international financial system being centered around the US financial system in terms of payments, the role of the US dollar. It's almost impossible if you do international business not being exposed to the US sanctions. And we have seen in the case of Iran and Russia that those sanctions can bite very hard. So I would say it is possible. I personally think that, for instance, sanctioning of large Chinese companies, maybe even Hong Kong-based companies, is more likely than, for instance, the US trying successfully to destabilize the Hong Kong dollar peg.
The difference between sanctions on Iran or Russia are clearly that there is a much higher level of connectivity currently between the US economy and US companies and counterparts inside China. And what isn't yet in the equation, yes, it's physically possible for the American administration to exert extreme pain on any economy, including China. But what would the collateral damage be to American companies that have massive interests and the companies of allied economies to the United States? What ramifications would there be for those companies? That interconnectivity between the mainland and the global economy is much more intricate than it was in Russia or could be in Iran. And that raises a lot of questions which nobody has properly examined yet.
Yeah,
I fully agree with that. It is at the same time true that we have seen this current U.S. administration taking measures that hurt their own companies as well. For instance, if you ban exports to Huawei, that hit a lot of U.S. companies quite hard. I think what is worrying for us economists at the moment is that economic principles start to lose the upper hand compared to politics, geopolitics, national politics. And I feel that especially in the US, government leaders seem to be willing to push the envelope to prioritize politics over economics, even if it means their own companies will be hurt.
Yes. I would go further than that, because I don't think it's a shift to the influence of politics. It's a shift to the influence of security and intelligence agencies. And what worries me as an economist here is that pretty much any discussion that we could have had over the last 30 years could be examined empirically with information that's in the public domain, where we could examine claims and test whether those claims are reasonable or not. Now that we have this absolute explosion of influence of security and intelligence agencies into the discussion, as soon as you start to try to test the assertions, what you get is, I'm sorry, we can't tell you.
Yeah.
That is very alarming, very alarming,
Yeah.
because it allows a lot of things to occur that simply can't be tested.
Let me just add one more thing there. David mentioned about if there is a sanction against the Chinese companies, financial companies, there would be consequences to the financial companies in the United States, which is absolutely true. What I see the risk is beyond the risk of corporates. This potentially could even create some systematic risk. When you knock down a large enough a financial company, it's not just that company having trouble. Because there are just billions of these transactions among the banks. When you push down the first domino, it doesn't really matter whether you put it back or not. The chain reaction happens. We saw this during the Lehman crisis. And this is where that we got to be very, very careful that we don't just see the first piece of domino say, hey, it's manageable. When it comes to the financial industry, the risk of interreaction and uncertainty are extremely high.
So be careful of what you're asking for. Let's go back to the broader question. Basically, all of you three are saying, this thing is not done yet. We have already seen many things happen, but lots of things could happen in the coming months or even years. So apparently, we have losing the old balance, but the new balance has yet to emerge between China and the United States, and Hong Kong included. So what are the possible? You just mentioned the two hemispheres, but what are the factors to ensure that the two hemispheres will not go into a cycle that from bad to worse? What kind of factors you are seeing that you're confident saying the two spheres can coexist instead of leading to a one side lose, one side win scenario? Or I know Dr. You have mentioned Thucydides' trap many times in his public speeches. So what kind of things do you see that can avoid this scenario?
Well, we are talking about two very large countries. the leaders there are not, sometimes they may act a little bit unusual, but there are systems trying to prevent things going to extreme. I'm still hopeful that each administration knows what they're doing, and there are some mechanism to check the balance. These are two large countries with nuclear weapons. These are the large countries that probably would not just, a decision would not just impact their economies, but the global economies. So that I do believe that the leaders have a sense of, they do have some sense. That's the only thing that, in my opinion, is important to prevent things getting really crazy. So far, while we're seeing quite interesting interactions between two, but on the other hand, I do see the ability to refrain them going to the extreme, extraordinary scenario.
Yeah, this guys, do you think like trade and economic relations exchanges can help to maintain this new balance?
Yeah, I think so. We have already seen that, right? We have seen these tendencies to go for confrontation being tempered by business, by other outsiders, by also mechanisms within the systems. I think another question that both of these countries should, both of these leaders and these teams of leaders should ask themselves is, okay, on the one hand, I have a Cold War with my primary counterpart, but I also want to be seen globally as a respectable agent, a respectable actor. To what extent, if I push my agenda too far, to what extent can I still be seen as a responsible stakeholder in the international system? Think about it from China's side. Yes, China could, in principle, pretty much do what it wants with vis-a-vis Hong Kong, vis-a-vis Xinjiang, vis-a-vis Tibet. But I think that we have already seen that it starts to lose some of the goodwill internationally if it does that too much. Same thing with the US. If it wants to be seen as the leader of the free world, it also needs to, do its homework in other dimensions, and it cannot only pound the table on the things that China does wrong. So I'm not 100% certain that there is enough, that these leaders are driven enough by this incentive. I just hope that they are, because that would be another way to temper these confrontational issues.
Okay.
I spend a lot of my time on APEC, the 21-member economy group across the Asia-Pacific region. And within APEC, we've seen another aspect of this conflict emerging, which has been causing us a lot of anxiety, and that is the US preference for bilateralism or unilateralism. I'm pleased to say that after 3 years of unilateralist activity by the White House, APEC as an organization is still very firmly 20 economies against one in our preference for using multilateral institutions, multilateral dialogue to tackle the problems that we share. And so from my point of view, putting into some perspective the rather alarming possibilities that we've talked about, I see some encouragement that still there's a resolution among the other 20 economies in APEC that they do not want to see the world broken down into a proliferation of bilateral agreements. I think there's an important aspect that arises out of this bilateralism, in that the US has not only created great difficulty with with China, but it has also alienated a lot of traditional allies too. And that has given, I think, the Chinese government an opportunity, which I frankly think so far they haven't properly used, an opportunity to build bridges with other economies that can balance these very negative forces.
Yes, Dr. Toy, you have something to add on this comment?
I think what David said is quite right. In my observation, this is a wrestling for the global influence, so that we must not ignore the rest of the globe.
Yes.
Besides the United States and China, there are Asian countries, European countries, African countries, etc. Okay, so that, and none of these won't get caught in the middle of taking the side.
Yeah.
While they sometimes need to move one direction or the other from their own interests, but they don't want to do that. And I think that no matter whether it's China or the United States, this is also constrained how far they could push to the extreme.
It's a very interesting point, because we are seeing that, China and the United States, the two big boys are fighting the room, and the rest are like, what's going on here? But it seems like the options or the choices for these other players are getting smaller. You have to, as you say, if the world is divided into two hemispheres, the middle ground is actually very limited. Now let's move back to China, India, and this border clash. Of course, that has lots of historical reasons, but lots of people also see this as happening between India has to think clearly whether it wants to be in the more in the China orbit, or in the US orbit, or if you want independence, how to maintain this delicate balance. So I think the challenges for other countries are very big, right? It's much easier to say than to actually have this balance. Hong Kong is doing benefit a lot from if the China and the United States getting well. Now it becomes the battleground. So my question for you is, what they can actually do to influence these two hemispheres, two big powers?
No, personally, I think there are lots of things they can be done, and they are actually doing something. For example, the U.S. Attempt to block Huawei into the global 5G equipment supplier.
Yes.
Europe played a significant role. Although they are not making a big noise, but by not accepting U.S. recommendations, this actually was a statement, and now seems a little bit swinging. All these things do matter. They are probably not a high volume kind of sounds heard, but these things, in my opinion, matters a lot, and in the future, they will still be one of the key considerations for US or for China to consider.
Yeah, for Mr. Dogwell, I have a follow-up question. You just mentioned of the multilateralism, and there's some encouraging signs. People want to, to use these to balance the rivalry. But the problem is, it seems the rivalry between China and the United States are making these multilateral organization institutions, from APEC to WTO to G20, they're losing their influence if the two big players in it are not getting along with each other. So how to solve this problem? I mean, for Europe, for instance, you cannot go to the WTO again to play the mediating role between China and the United States. You have to sign a bilateral with Trump, or you talk with Beijing over another bilateral. How to solve this problem?
Actually, at the WTO level, I think that pressure has been resisted.
Yeah.
And while it is a sticky plaster, the Europeans have reached agreement with a large number of other economies to settle any disputes that arise and to continue to make agreements, plurilateral, not including the entire WTO membership, but nevertheless substantial plurilateral initiatives in a number of areas. So despite the headwinds that have come from the fact that the US is not participating in these discussions, there is still a fairly resolute effort by particularly the Europeans to countervail that, to make sure that we can still reach international agreements that are multilaterally expandable.
Okay, Mr. Price?
Yeah, I agree with that. I think multilateralism is not dead yet. I think the biggest damage done to multilateralism is a miscalculated decision in in the heads of the current U.S. president that multilateralism is not in the U.S.'s benefit. I think we don't know what will happen in November with the elections, but I think especially if there were to be another president, I would also expect the U.S. to be less against unilateralism. And I think more generally, many countries, many people globally are still in favor of multilateralism, and I would not write it off too quickly.
Yes, Dr. Tuck.
I would not rule out the role of multilateral agents at this moment, but I want to bring this to a bigger picture. The bigger picture was, after the Second World War, the U.S. led the rebuild of the global order. This includes United Nations, GATT, IMF, World Bank, WHO, etc. So that was the order being built during that time. And that system worked quite well. That this has created accelerating momentum of globalization. From trade, from capital movement, from people movement, from goods movement, to blah, blah, blah.
Yeah.
And that has created one of the best times in our human history, with the benefit of globalization spreading to the rest of the world. Almost every corner, not just the rich countries, almost every corner, this unprecedented level of penetration of prospect to the entire world. And because of that, our world did not see another big war, a world war for 70 years. But this seems to me coming to the end because of job losses in the developed countries.
Will Scap.
Yes, and also the debt crisis, etc. So this reverse probably started like 7-8 years ago. With one of the highlight was President Trump being elected in the United States. And the other extreme parties in Europe, they did not win the power in most countries, but their influence has gained dramatically. And most importantly, the central left and the central right kind of setup for the political system seems collapsing. Okay, I think if we look into the reverse of globalization, this is happening. Maybe we're in the early stage of that. And the topic we talked about, China and the US, is just part of this reverse of globalization. That's my personal opinion.
Yes, Mr. Kreis, I have something to add.
I'm going to be maybe a little bit more optimistic. I think obviously globalization is facing huge challenges at the moment. On the economic front, we actually are doing some research on that at the moment. On the economic front, we can actually not yet speak of deglobalization. What we are seeing is that globalization nowadays proceeds at a slower pace than it did in the past. And we don't know what will happen in the future. We'll need to see. But I think more generally, I think there is nothing inherent in the current global setup, even with these two global powers with different political systems, that makes further globalization and further multilateralism impossible. And therefore, I would not want to write off multilateralism too quickly. There is one thing, I think under President Xi Jinping, China is different than it was under his predecessor in many ways, but Xi Jinping also emphasized that China is interested in further integrating in the global economy, further international engagement. And so I don't think that there is something inherently impossible about the US and China to both be in favor of multilateralism. There have, of course, been, as Tao Dong said, there have been many countries in which populism has taken the upper hand, and populism is equating globalization with inequality, but that's not really right. That is basically lazy governments that have opened up but not done enough to help their people. So in those countries, and there are quite a few European ones, where governments did act more sensibly and actually helped people to cope with globalization, you also don't see such a big backlash. And so I would still say that we don't know. Things could go wrong, but I still don't want to write it off.
Okay.
Sorry.
Yeah,
I think the multilateralism isn't dead at all, and I think we haven't talked about it so far. But COVID-19, the pandemic, is an absolutely perfect example of not only why multilateralism will continue, but why it's indispensable. The problems that have been generated and are still being generated by the pandemic cannot be resolved within a single economy, no matter how large that economy is. In APEC at the moment, we're looking specifically at how to rebuild trusted travel.
Yeah.
That requires a large number of multilateral entities to come together and hundreds of countries to come together to agree on protocols. What we don't want and cannot afford, it will not be a solution, is the US setting up a set of protocols to manage the recovery of international movement, the EU doing the same thing, China doing the same thing, Singapore doing something different, Japan doing something different. We've got to agree a long and complex queue of protocols that will enable us to resume travel as we emerge from this crisis. And that can only be done through multilateral agreement. And that's just one tiny example. And there are many, many around the recovery from COVID, which illustrate exactly the same thing. Is almost certainly doomed to failure. But that doesn't mean a lot of harm can't be done in the meanwhile.
So it's very interesting. Dr. Tao just mentioned all these public institutions, kind of public goods provided by the United States after the Second World War. But now the United States is walking away from these. WHO is a typical example. So can China really pick up these things and play the new leading role? And what China can do to rally the others to maintain these kinds of multilateralism?
Well, the short answer is no, at least not in the short time. The U.S. took leadership after the war. It had a few, that time, clear features there. The U.S. dominated in the military world, diplomatic world, economic world. So that the U.S. pushed this through that, especially the U.S. opened the domestic market and foreign aids to rebuild. Okay, China tried to take some initiatives. The most visible ones called One Belt and One Road, right? And they try to use the monetary aids to help the other countries. Well, China perhaps does have the economic muscle and perhaps the will of opening the domestic market. But China does not have the political influence.
Or the military capabilities.
Or the military capabilities. That is creating a problem. Without the other two coming along, it's going to be a difficult process to push it forward, especially in the countries with democratic elections. The government changes every 4 years. And that also creates added difficulties there. So my opinion is the Chinese government is trying, but it doesn't, probably not quite there yet. And this pandemic does not really help China in that effort.
I agree with that. I agree with that analysis. I would add one thing, to be completely honest with you. I don't think China has the soft power. That was an important ingredient for the US's success in building this international system. I think China could have done a little better in terms of international diplomacy recently, and China would do well to learn some lessons if it really wants to become that major, international player that is pushing the agenda globally, it needs to be a little bit more sensitive to other people's sensitivity.
You agree?
I do, but I think there's some interesting other forces at work here. I, back in 1982, was working in the China Daily, training their earliest journalists.
Yeah.
And what intrigued me in 1982, as the country was just opening up, was this discussion going on saying, we want to build an international presence. We want our companies to establish a presence in the United States, in Germany, in Europe. But market entry into these hugely powerful economies is impossible. Their companies are too big. We couldn't compete possibly. We couldn't even buy brand presence in these economies because of the formidable dominance of the existing players in those markets. So let's focus on those economies where we can cheaply establish brand presence. Guess where? African economies, Southeast Asian economies, South American
That's
economies.
almost like an earlier version of Belt and Road.
No, it's exactly right. But what happened was they decided that building big presence in the established economies that were dominating the global economy was not a manageable thing. So long-term strategy, let's go where we can go. So China, yes, does lack alliances and impact policy making in G7 or in the EU or in the US, but it does have, even today, significant diplomatic heft in a very, very large number of economies that we don't measure as important. Nigeria, Indonesia, Brazil, wherever.
Yeah, that's very interesting because Dr. Tao said very good. China, for China itself, it realizes it cannot put its fits into U.S. shoes right now. But at least China is thinking about maybe, from Belt and Road countries, maybe from China and Asia, kind of Asia. We have a shared destiny in economy, in trade, or in public health. Was this being possible in the broad context of the China-U.S. rivalry, Dr. Tao?
Well, I think it's possible, but it's getting more difficult.
Yeah,
it's possible in the sense that one, China still has a very large domestic market that many other countries would love to have, and that is one thing. Perhaps China would still have friends. The second thing is China is rising. I think its soft power is going to increase. I was at Suzhou and saw some of the silk products. The designing is very, very good. All right, I would say that I would love to use this one at 1/10 of price of some of the international brand because I can see the quality there. So these kind of things are being built. But the reason I say that it's going to be more difficulty is that the U.S. is taking an attitude that either you are my friend or you're my enemy. With that, then we probably will see significant countries would not get too close to China, but probably still willing to sit in the middle or a little bit closer to the U.S., but not entirely to the U.S. Also, China is flashing its own muscle. Australia is very close to the United States, and look at the visa policy, trade policies getting changed, right? So I do think that with the current atmosphere, things are going to be more difficult, but it's not impossible.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned Australia because we know China and Australia should be perfect trade partners. The China needs the iron ores. The Chinese consumers love the Australian beef and wine, but still, we can see like troubles can't just stop on the bilateral relationship between Beijing and Canberra. So, Mr. Kais, was this being a common thing, for other countries, even for ASEAN? ASEAN is now the largest export market for China, but it's still over the South China Sea. It seems the stance of ASEAN are hardened. So how do we reconcile these two? Economically and trade, we have more closer relationship with China, but on the other security or geopolitical issues, we're more drift away. How to reconcile these kind of two contradictions?
Yeah, I think the relationship with Australia is a good one to use as an example, because if you go back 10, 15 years ago, Australia actually, the Australian government spent quite some efforts and energy on formulating a policy stance. They realized that in terms of traditional military and diplomatic alliance, we are with the US. In terms of our economic interaction, we are mostly reliant on China. At that time, it felt like there was some way to manage this. This was a different era, right? 10 years ago. Now it turns out that in a different global setting, and with also China having changed its behavior, I would say it is not so easy to be it is not so easy to be engaging with China on the one hand, but being a bit critical on the other hand. So I think what Tao Dong said, I personally think that's also true for China. If you're not my friend, then you are on the other side, and that I think that underscores how it has become more difficult, because it's not just in Australia. And of course, David is right that there are a lot of countries where, to be completely honest, it is a little bit easier to buy diplomatic alliance. But for instance, in Europe, we have similar issues with countries that have spent an awful lot of time talking with each other on how can we engage with China on issues where we think there is room for engagement, the economy, but also things like climate change. But on the other hand, we have very different views on issues like human rights, and so how on earth are we going to marry that? It's not. We're not out of the woods on that.
Yes, I mean, I think that there's another point being made by the Americans at the moment, which needs to be tested more carefully, and that is that China constitutes a unique existential threat to themselves and the global economy. And putting on my sort of anthropology hat, and long time ago, I wasn't an anthropologist. There is clearly massive difference between China and the US, but I see just as significant sets of differences between India and the US, Indonesia and the US, Nigeria and the US. China objectively is not existentially different in a unique way. There are many economies that have very different systems that are very hard to reconcile with the US. The comfort for the US over the last 70 years is that it, through the Marshall Plan and through the Bretton Woods institutions, created a world order in its own image. And it's been relatively easy for them to move comfortably across the world using those institutions that their own companies are familiar with. That is proving less and less easily manageable.
Okay. Before we go into the Q&A, I have last pressing question. Will the situation be a little bit different after November election? You blamed Trump for lots of things, Mr. Dudwell, but as Mr. Tao said, this is a kind of, lifelong rivalry. It's not because of one person. It's just because of institutional wealth gap. The middle class. The political changes. So, will there be any a difference if Biden wins the presidential election and not Trump?
I personally think that there might be some personal color difference there, but other than that, it's not going to be different. U.S. attitude towards China is that no matter whether it's Democrat or Republican, no matter the right side of elites or the left side of elite, no matter the blue color or the white color, in the front of versus China, I think the country's stance is pretty much unified.
Yes.
So that even President Trump leaves the White House, this might create a little bit of approaching difference, but fundamental kind of rivalry, in my opinion, probably will not change.
I agree completely that there is in the US a very broad political alignment on how to look at China. I do think there is one key difference, though, between the two, and that is on multilateralism. How do you build alliances, and how do you use existing ones, or do you want to destroy them? And I think in my personal projection, I think a Biden presidency will be different. It may not, at first sight, it may look actually harder for China, because a Biden presidency is more likely to find allies that it can use to force China to make some changes in its international behavior. But I would say the end result will be much better. It will be a more multilateral kind of more multilateral world, where globalization stands a bigger chance of surviving.
I think that's completely right. The transactional unilateral characteristics of the Trump administration are distinct, and if he were not to be re-elected, then he would have there would be a very distinct change in the style of engagement that the US has with the rest of the world. There was a very interesting article in the Financial Times a week ago saying that the Chinese would prefer Trump, and that's exactly because he has successfully alienated a large number of his allies, traditional allies, and has made waves with many economies that traditionally would default to support the United States. 4 more years of that would, they believe, give the Chinese opportunity to build more constructive relationships. Biden, in contrast, while I think he will be hard on China in the way that Europe is being hard on China as it's negotiating the investment agreement, but he will want to use multilateral channels and use alliances to develop a consensus before approaching the China problems.
Okay, very good point. Now it's Q&A time, and the audience can send in questions for our panelists. The first question is, now with the US stock exchange regulations coming down harder on Chinese companies, could this possibly help Hong Kong? There will be more IPOs in Hong Kong, there will be more traders going to the Hong Kong Stock Exchange?
My view is yes, absolutely. Hong Kong is also in a process of gradually changing its role with China and dealing with the rest of the world. Some of the traditional advantages seems disappearing, but one very distinguished strength is in the financial industry. And in the financial industry, 2 things pops up. One is the IPO and the secondary market. The other one is wealth management, especially the private banking part. I think with the US and China get locked into some kind of a rivalry, financial market, Chinese companies listed in the United States would have some problems. Even the US has not really closed the door. The Chinese companies probably would flood out to where are they going to be listed? Maybe if you go into China, but there's a supply of the stocks that potentially could undermine the A-shares market. I think large parts will come to Hong Kong. That probably would strengthen Hong Kong's role as a financial hub.
I agree.
Okay, very good. Yeah.
Yes.
So it's a bit of irony, isn't it? Because the US tried to punish China over Hong Kong, but actually, in the end, actually boosted Hong Kong's role, making Hong Kong more important.
It might end up being one of the systemic changes, but another systemic change, I think, regardless of what happens beyond the election in November, is that Chinese companies will bring more of their supply chains back into the country, which will hurt many countries involved in the supply chains and hurt those US companies that currently engage in those supply chains. And the Chinese will inevitably try very, very hard, even though it's going to take a decade or so, to bring technologies inside their own country. That never would have happened. It never needed to happen, but it will now happen regardless.
But it's a kind of irony. Okay, this time the US is having a much bigger fiscal deficit this year. We project 25% of GDP. And this will be largely funded by Fed printing the money.
Yes.
Okay, in China, they decided to go a different path. That the deficit GDP ratio being set at 3.6%. no monetizing the fiscal deficit.
Mm-hmm.
And this will be funded by people's savings, etc.
Mm.
So that the money printing in the US or to the dollar zone is much bigger.
Mm.
It's irony that the Fed's printing money, and part of this money is going to flow into the Hong Kong market to fund the Chinese tech companies.
Yeah. The next question is also very good from Margaret Liu. The question is, as one of the speakers mentioned, Hong Kong plays a very important role for Chinese companies to raise capital. But in the long run, does it mean that Hong Kong will become a Chinese financial center instead of an international financial center? Louis?
Well, I think this is a good question. It raises a point that follows from what Tao Dong was saying, that Hong Kong is actually at the moment benefiting somewhat from that tension between the US and China. Mm. That can only work as long as the rest of the world sees Hong Kong as a separate financial and commercial entity. And that means that it continues to be in the interest of China's government to make sure that people globally, by and large, agree that Hong Kong is a separate financial and commercial entity where it makes a lot of sense to, engage with, do your investments in, all these kind of things. And so it just points to me that this shows there is a strong incentive that China has to continue to persuade the rest of the world that Hong Kong, that the one country, two systems arrangement remains broadly intact.
Mm. But if we look at the past IPOs, it is true that most of the biggest or the largest IPOs in Hong Kong are dominantly mainland Chinese companies.
I think that's been true for a very long time. And it's not just the listings, the companies, mainland Chinese companies in many shapes and sizes now dominate Hong Kong's stock market, and in many respects dominate the labor market too. A large number of those mainland Chinese companies are largely staffed by executives coming in from the mainland to spend time in their Hong Kong offices and then going back into the mainland. Hong Kong will continue to rely on Chinese companies still pressing hard to engage with the global economy. As long as they do that, then as a headquarter hub, as a financial hub, as an accounting hub, Hong Kong has a very, very strong future.
Okay, now we have the last question, maybe because time is limited. Maybe this question is for you, Dr. Tao. Is it from Edward Lau? How far would the panelists believe that EU could follow the lead of the US in putting more pressure on Hong Kong as a pivotal against China? Wouldn't that, by that time, the chessboard then be tilted further to the United States instead of China?
Mm-hmm. Let me just give a quick answer, and perhaps the other panelists would add more. EU has already voiced strong opinion over this topic. EU probably, at least for the time being, is not taking the US approach of very harsh to hammer the whole thing, but the political stance is very clear. Mm-hmm. My personal opinion is that China probably want to differentiate EU from the United States.
Yeah. Chris, do you have anything to add?
No, I agree. The EU is taking a different stance. It is explicitly doing so. They are stressing that they want to take a different stand. They do have the same opinion though, and so I don't know exactly how this is going to play out. I think at the end of the day, the EU will end up being pretty close to the US in terms of the substance.
Okay.
Yes, I believe that the EU, it would be more aligned to a Biden type approach. They have strong concerns about the shape of the Chinese economy and their ability to engage, but they want to follow multilateral mechanisms to do that. And so they will remain different from the United States from that point of view.
Very good. So thank you to our panelists for sharing your valuable insights. And thank you again for Credit Suisse sponsoring this webinar. And before we go, I want to let our viewers know that the next webinar in this series will take place on July 14th, and will be on this topic: Are online services the investment product of the future? That's all for us today. Thank you for everyone for tuning in to watch, and look forward to welcoming you next time.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.